So welcome, Carla Hills.
Well, it's a great pleasure to join you. Thank you for your generous remarks.
So Carla, you've had a spectacular career in many, many areas. You're also a member of the Academy of Housing and Communities. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's an organization that Kent Watkins, who was staff assistant on the Hill, Senate and House, over at HUD, and so many important positions, but he's keenly interested in housing as well as international affairs. And he put this academy together and brings together the former people from HUD and staff members for good discussion on what's going on today. He was instrumental in putting together a wonderful program on the 50th anniversary of HUD. He has celebrated people that he thinks and we think have made a difference. Bob Rubin is one who got an award from the Academy. So he's quite unique, and it's wonderful that you should ask about him.
Well, you grew up in an era, as I did, when women working, especially at the career levels you have attained, just wasn't an option. You went to Stanford, and then you graduated from Yale with your law degree. Where did the passion for that direction begin?
I would say that I thought I would like to be a lawyer at about the third grade. We had a public library near our house, and I used to read a lot, and I read Gertrude Atherton's book on Hamilton. And so as I was growing up, I would tell my family, my dad was very bright. He was a self-made man and had not even graduated from high school. And nobody said, oh, you can't do it. And so I continued to think that's what I want to do. When I say nobody said I could not do it, I remember in about the 11th grade in high school, we had to write an essay about what we hoped to accomplish. And I said, I'd like to be a lawyer. And my teacher said to me, women aren't lawyers. But when I went to Stanford, I got more passionate on the topic, and I went out with a young man who was in the law school, Roderick Hills. And he was first in his class at Stanford Law School and then went on to clerk on the Supreme Court in 1958 for Justice Stanley Reed. Well, we stayed in close touch. He used to come up to Yale to see me, and but I was keenly interested in law very, very early on.
And back in those days, I can just see that teacher patting you on the shoulder and saying, well, dear, you know, that's just not a field for women. I could just see that.
But you know, when I got to Yale, there were only 7 women in my class of 177. And so women were not lawyers. And when various voices would say, we're not giving women equality, I thought to myself, if a corporation wanted to hire women, the pool of talent was extraordinarily small. And so if every corporation wanted just one, there weren't enough. Incredibly, today at Yale, a majority of women, I believe I'm correct, a majority of the people in the law school are women. So it's really changed in a short period of time.
What was it like when you were at Yale in the classes in the beginning? You know, did people take you seriously? Did you talk up much? Did people turn around and look at you? What was it?
Oh, it was a great, great experience. I had a wonderful classmates. We were all close friends. And while I was at Yale, a professor, J.W. Moore, who's famous for his federal practice, I took his class. And then he hired me to be his assistant to work on papers. And I stayed in close touch with him. In fact, when I came back to Los Angeles and became an assistant U.S. attorney, I was still active in these sorts of activities. And I wrote a book called Federal Civil Practice. I would never have done that, but for the encouragement and the talent of Professor Moore.
Sometimes our teachers really don't know how big an influence that they have on us. And it sometimes takes a long time to look back. Have you ever gone back with him and talked to him?
Well, I certainly stayed in touch with him. He's, of course, at this stage in life, passed away. But he came to visit with his wife to California. And Rod and I, Rod was the gentleman who clerked on the Supreme Court, and we were married in 1958. And Professor Moore and his wife came out. I can remember we took them to show them some of the top spectacular spots to see in Los Angeles. And he became a very good friend.
Well, that's terrific. You served as Assistant United States Attorney in Los Angeles, and then you went on to become a partner with a private law firm, in addition to being an adjunct professor at UCLA. So you were an authority at that point, and maybe part of your book, on federal practice and antitrust law. Did that influence your decision to want to work in Washington?
Not at all. I had absolutely no idea that I would ever end up in Washington. Just no idea whatsoever. We formed the firm then known as Munger, Tolles and Hills, now Munger, Tolles and Olson, a wonderful firm, still my best friends, in 1962. And I can recall Rod coming home and saying, I've only been at the firm I joined. And he joined the firm by being recruited by Charlie Munger. And he said, after 3 years, they want to offer me a partnership, but I don't want to be a partner in that firm. And I said, you ought to do what you want to do. And he said, would you think if we started a firm? I said, whatever you want to do, I would love to do. And so he went to Charlie and he said, they've offered me this partnership. I don't want to accept it because I won't stay and I want to leave. And Charlie said, you leave, I leave. And then he went to Roy Tolles and he said the same thing. And Roy said, you leave, I leave. So we started out with starting a firm with 7, and that included Rod, me, Charlie, Roy, and Dick Esbenshade, and Fred Warder. All of them had been with a former firm. And then it just grew, and we have wonderful people that we were able to recruit. But I was the only litigator. And since I had experience in the federal court in Los Angeles, then known as the Southern District of Los Angeles, now it's called the Central District of California, the Southern District of California. So I was very busy. My big advantage came when a wonderful man, Jim McKay, who was the partner at Covington and Burling, was looking for a local counsel in Los Angeles and worked with me on an antitrust case. And antitrust was one of my interests. And but it also was a very large case, which was very good for the firm and good to keep me into not only federal practice, but federal antitrust practice. So I had no dream of going to Washington until, I was very active in the bar associations, Federal Bar Association, Women Lawyers Association, American Bar Association. And Elliot Richardson, who was then Attorney General, came to Los Angeles and asked me if I would consider becoming Assistant Attorney General in Washington in charge of the Civil Division. That's how, that was my first even inkling that I would go to Washington.
Tell us a little more about Elliot Richardson.
Ah, what a wonderful man. You know, this was a very difficult period. We had the Watts riots and problems in Los Angeles during the 60s. And in Washington, there was turmoil. Spiro Agnew, vice president, had stepped down in corruption allegations. And President Nixon was in the Watergate problem. And so it was a confusing and difficult period. When Elliot called me and asked me if I would consider this, I only taught antitrust as an adjunct professor for one semester. And that's because my good friend Murray Schwartz, who was dean of the law school at UCLA, called me and said, Carla, I'm in a big jam. The professor who teaches antitrust has gotten connected in a romantic involvement in Paris and does not want to come back. And I need someone to step in, and I have no time. This was like January. And I said, Murray, I've not taught the antitrust course. And he said, yeah, well, you can do it. So I did it. I did it because he was a good friend, and I had 157 students. They were all very good. And I worked like the dickens to handle that class. And the firm was very good about giving me the time to work on that. We had a program of which we called a sabbatical program, so that you could leave and then return. And so that spring quarter, the spring semester, I taught antitrust law.
I remember back then that the country was really in turmoil. We had high inflation, we had high unemployment, and people were still upset about the Vietnam War. There was still a lot of anger and dissent, and it was smoldering. As you went into the civil division in the Justice Department, did any of that turmoil affect what you did there?
Absolutely. After Elliot's call, I explained that I was teaching that quarter and I couldn't come back for an interview to have him consider whether or not he really wanted to hire me and have his team meet me. And so Rod and I made an arrangement to be in Washington in the fall. And I came back. I had lunch with Elliot's wife, Anne, and she talked to me about the schools for our 4 children. And I met Bill Ruckelshaus and Bob Bork, the top people at the Justice Department. And at the end of the 3-day interview, I said, okay, I'll do it. This was October 20th. And Rod and I got on a plane and went back to Los Angeles, turned on the radio, and that day turned out to be the day of the Saturday Night Massacre, where Elliot stepped down, Bill Ruckelshaus stepped down, and I said, I'm not going to go. I don't even know who's going to be Attorney General. Well, in January, Senator Bill Saxby called me and asked me to take the position. And the one who really recruited me was Bob Bork. He was a former Yalie. He was Solicitor General. He called me and he said, Carla, you don't know how tough it is. I'm trying to hold the Justice Department together, and it's extremely difficult. I'm being criticized for staying, but I don't want the Justice Department to be frayed and not work. And so I talked it over with Rod, and he said, yeah, I think that you could do that. And so I did go back in that year, which was a wonderful period of time in terms of the experience. But as you point out, there was turmoil. President Nixon finally stepped down at the urging of his replacement, Gerald R. Ford, who was perhaps one of the best presidents we've ever had. He's certainly in the top league along with George Bush Sr. being apolitical in the sense that he made friends on both sides of the aisle. And so he was extremely good at making policy over politics. So you're right. He made tough decisions, like he gave amnesty to those who ran away and did not want to serve in the Vietnam War. Vietnam War was very unpopular. We had double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. The riots in the streets in Washington, all 7 bridges were closed down. And so this was a very difficult time. And the President Ford just led us through it. And he deserves a lot of credit.
Now, you mentioned the Saturday Night Massacre, and people our age remember that, but most of the younger people are probably sitting there going, what is that?
Yeah, well, President Nixon asked Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox. Archibald Cox was doing the investigation into the Watergate, then now known as the scandal. And Elliot, who was a magnificent statesman, who again put policy over politics, said, I can't do that. And so they went to Bill Ruckels's house, his second, and Bill said, I can't do that. They both stepped down. And so that was the October of, the October of 1973. And I came to Washington in January or February, I guess it was, of 1974.
So what was the role of the Civil Division within the Justice Department?
The Civil Division handles all the litigation involving the cabinet offices. So you get to know the various cabinet, like I got to know HUD because there was a lot of litigation with respect to discrimination and the like. And but all of the cabinet departments were represented by the lawyers in the Civil Division. And a lot of people had left. My deputy, interestingly enough, it was Dick Levine, a wonderful lawyer. Well, Dick Levine had been in charge of the civil side of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. He and Locke Waters, who was at the head of the office, hired me. So I worked for Dick Levine. And when I went back and I was looking to put a team together, I called Dick in Los Angeles and said, could I persuade you to come back and be my deputy? And he did. So I really had a talented team. Erwin Goldblum was on my team. I mean, I had really wonderful people at the Justice Department. I look back on those days as a real privilege of serving with outstanding lawyers.
And a good indoctrination into the federal system.
I beg your pardon?
A good indoctrination into the federal system because you had a cross-platform with all the cabinet members.
Yes, well, they all weren't in litigation, but it was, we got to know a lot of people and we got to know what their mission was. And we certainly got to know the people. Their general counsels, I would say, were much more attuned to us than the secretaries themselves.
Tell me how you transitioned to being secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Ford.
Well, then again, it was something I didn't expect. I was getting ready to take our children to the zoo on a Saturday, and our phone rang, and they said, the president wants to speak to you and speak to you today. It was a Saturday. Well, you don't say no thank you to the president. So I said to Rod, we can meet afterwards, but I don't know what this is about. I don't know whether it's about some case that we're handling or what it's all about. And so I went over to the White House, and President Ford said, I would like you to be Secretary of HUD. And I said, Mr. President, I'm not an urbanologist. He said, I need a good manager. And well, you don't turn down the president. He, especially in those days when he was trying so hard to put together his team. So I did make the transition. I believe it was like in March. And the reason I remember it is because on my first meeting with my team at HUD, I reminded them that we had passed the housing bill in 74. It was the first bill that President Ford signed as president. And I said, how many units are we going to get out of this bill? Because I will be asked that when I go up to give testimony on our budget. Silence. I said, come on, how many are we going to do? We promised 500,000. Silence. Turned out the answer was none, because the regulations had not been drafted and they had to be put out for comment for 60 days, and then you had to assimilate them. And in those days, the budget year ended June 30. It went June 30 to July 1st, not as we do it today, September to or October 1 to September 30. And so I had the privilege of going up to testify to say, we're not going to get any units out, but I promise you that we will beat the 500,000 in the year to come, which we did.
Well, that legislation, to me, was probably the most spectacular, with the biggest influence of practically anything that Congress has passed in the housing realm. And maybe it's just because that was the era that I was really involved, but that's where we had 7 forms, if I remember right, of Section 8 in there, both public and private sector involvement, a lot of production. That's the units you're talking about. So what else, in your opinion, contributed to the significance of that act?
I think President Ford was a big contributor. He believed that we ought to give states more authority. And you may recall that the 74 Act was the first step. But in June of 75, we had the Emergency Housing Bill. And the Emergency Housing Bill of 75 would have subsidized mortgages of yours, mine, everybody's, down to 6% when we had double-digit interest rates. And we also had double-digit inflation. President Ford looked at this and said, this will kill the economy. And so I took it back on the Hill, and that's when the fact that there were so many in the middle. Lloyd Ashley, said, a Democrat, said, this is a turkey that will not fly. And we worked together, and within 6 days, we had an amended bill back on the president's desk that would subsidize mortgages down to 6% for the lowest quintile, with a sunset provision at the end of the year, the end of this fiscal year. And we signed this bill on July 2nd, 1975. The original bill had been brought to the president on June 24th, 1975. That's a pretty fast turnaround, and it was due to the friends and respect that President Ford had across the aisle. And I still have a picture in my office of the signing of that emergency housing bill of 75, where Republicans and Democrats, Lloyd was there, Gary Hart was there, and President Ford was at a desk on the on the Rose Garden, and there were about 8 people standing around, smiling because we had gotten the work done.
I'll bet you're a pretty good negotiator, being an attorney and then also being a trial attorney. Is that one of your primary skills?
Well, I wouldn't like to assess what I do, but I've had a lot of opportunities to negotiate, and both in trade and in law, that it makes a difference. You really have to understand what the other side of the table is thinking, what their limitations are, what's within the art of the possible, and diplomacy plays a big part.
I'll bet it does. Now, you had to work with the head of OMB, and I think that was Jim Lind.
Yes.
Wasn't he your predecessor at HUD, or do I have that wrong?
You have that right.
Okay.
He's a wonderful guy. I often had disagreements with him, small. The wonderful thing about President Ford is, when we had a disagreement, I could call his secretary and set up a meeting, and the 3 of us would meet in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room. I would make my case for what I wanted. Jim would make his case for why he didn't want me to spend that money, and the president would rule from the bench. I always say he was the best judge I've ever argued a case before. But I can remember taking up a $10 million dispute. 10 million, of course, 10 million today then was a lot more today, plenty more. But it was, what we found was people who had never lived in a housing unit didn't know how to maintain it, and they needed some training. And they often did stupid things, like if the toilet wouldn't flush, they would break it by what they didn't know how to deal with. And so I brought that to the president, and he ruled on it, said, yes, you can do that. And it made a difference.
I'll bet it did. Did you have any problems getting that through OMB with Jim Lind?
No, we were good friends. I mean, it was, again, I mean, he disagreed. He was focused on the budget, inflation, and deficit, and I'm focused on housing programs and successive housing programs. And I felt it was an investment that paid for itself. Much better that you have some money for training. Is kind of the way I feel about our infrastructure today. I think that it's an investment in the future, whether you're talking about human infrastructure or physical infrastructure. It pays back, and that program did pay back, in my view.
I totally agree with you. There's no question about that. And I think we need a lot more of that, but that's just not where we're headed right now. Now, you had a hiatus from government life for a while, like 1978 through about 89.
Yes.
You were again a practicing attorney. And you also served as chairwoman of the Board of Trustees of the Urban Institute from 1983 through 88. And then what happened in 1989 when you were asked to serve under another president of the United States?
Well, again, I was surprised. It never occurred to me I'd go back into government, but I had just walked back from having lunch with a proposed client, and got to my office and got a call from the vice president's chief of staff, who said, the president would like to talk with you. And of course, you don't turn down that. And so I went back to the White House, and I sat with the president, and he said, I'd like you to be my U.S. trade representative. And I thought that was really a fascinating position. And again, I was so blessed because President Bush Sr. again goes into the top categories of presidents, I think, in our entire history. He was, again, puts policy over politics. He made the right decision even when it was tough for the country politically. And so he was really helpful. I used to send him a memorandum on trade every week because it was a busy period. Our hair was on fire about the Japanese, and we were negotiating upgrading the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And so we had a lot on our plate. We had problems with the Soviet Union. It had broken apart. We had negotiated a trade agreement with the Soviet Union and had to renegotiate it with the 15 republics because they wouldn't touch anything that had USSR on it. And so we were incredibly busy. I had a wonderful team, and I think we got a lot done.
As United States trade representative, you were really under pressure to implement the 1988 Omnibus Foreign Trade and Competitiveness Act, I think was the name of it, to go after countries that were considered to be trading unfairly with the U.S. So is that where you're talking about Japan and Russia?
No, well, Japan did come into that. Again, I talked to the president because under that act, we did have problems, and we had to designate the countries. We had a report that was due to Congress and designate countries that were not either meeting their commitments or meeting what we thought they should be doing. And I thought about using that act with respect to Japan. And then I thought, you know, to single out Japan is going to create hostility and probably create political problems in Japan. If they're part of a group that we name, and our watch list had many that were not enforcing intellectual property laws and various other things, it would be more of it would be less insulting. So we named Brazil and South Korea. And I resolved the problems with South Korea very rapidly. Han Sang-soo was then trade minister. He subsequently became ambassador to the United States, prime minister in Korea, head of the General Assembly up at the UN, extremely talented gentleman. And I stayed in touch with him. We're still very good friends. And then Sarney, who was president of Brazil, I had a meeting with him. We did begin to resolve those issues, but it also gave us a little bit of a cushion in dealing with the Japanese. And we had meetings with the Japanese, the Quad meeting, we called it, because in the days of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, it was Europe, Canada, Japan, and the United States that really directed where the trade issues were going. And so as a result of that, I became very good friends with the people involved in trade in Japan. And we were able to get a solution. I also had very good people at USTR who understood Japan. Lynn Williams was one of my deputies. Mike Moscow was one of my deputies. And of course I had Jules Katz, who was a genius. I mean, really superb. And so with a talented team, we were able to put together a deal that the president was very pleased with.
In fact, the Mexican government actually awarded you the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest honor given by the Mexican government to a non-citizen. Tell us about that award.
Well, it stemmed from our negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement. President Bush was very much interested in opening markets, believing that by opening markets, we not only created greater opportunity for our entrepreneurs, but that it would increase opportunities for those with whom we dealt, and it would influence their values. And of course, he was right. There's no question. The Peterson Institute has done a study to show that between 1950 and today, that our economy is $2 trillion better off by reason of our globalization, which is under attack right now by many in this country. And that poor countries benefited. Dr. William Klein, who is an economist also at the Peterson Institute, but I think he did this study when he was at the Center for Global Development. He calculated that for every percentage increase in trade by a poor country, they decreased their poverty by an equal percent. And that not only was the cheapest, greatest way to have a humanitarian effort, but it also reinforced our security, because countries that can't enforce their law often become havens for international crime. So we made a difference, I think, by trying to move forward with rules that would govern trade. And that was the Uruguay round, which was completed in 94.
Now, you still work as a consultant and public speaker, advising on investment and trade and risks abroad. So what inspires you to continue working?
I love it. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have something to keep me occupied and stop. You know, I really like the people I work with. They're all very, very talented. And I like our clients who are trying to do their best to achieve excellence. And it's wonderful. I mean, we go to countries. I can go down to a country like Argentina and say, you know, that discriminatory excise tax is actually costing you jobs and GDP. If you just do A instead of B, it would be a win-win situation. And, you know, those kinds of conversations often come back with a good reward. And so I hope our nation doesn't give up on that, to turn inward. As 5% of the world's population producing more than 15% of its output, we need to sell it abroad. And so I know that globalization is under duress right now, but we ought to deal with the problem that it creates. And that means invest in our human infrastructure. Most studies show that the job loss is not from international competition. Most of it is because people are dislodged because of technology. I used to go on the floor of an auto company and it looked like Fifth Avenue in New York Christmas time, and you could barely make your way through. Today you go on the floor of an auto company or an aircraft company, and it's all done remotely. There are 3 people on the floor, smocks, buffers on their shoes. They tell you to walk in certain lines so you don't create a problem. And this is very different. Well, our workers need to be invested in. You know, I often think of the Marshall Plan, and people thought of it as generosity, but it was an investment in the future. It created a better situation in the future. There's no question that if we were to make the same investments in education, training for our workers, that they would pay higher taxes in their better position and pay back, and it would be a win-win situation.
And people would be so much happier.
We hope so.
I don't think people really like being unemployed for long periods of time. And I think if we could put those resources, as you say, particularly into retraining, to match what's happening today with the job skills available. It'd be so much better.
You're so right.
Now, you've served on the boards of many Fortune 500 companies, and you've been awarded many honorary degrees. You've had numerous awards, including most recently the U.S. China Business Council's, let's see if I can say this right, Distinguished Honoree Award at its 45th anniversary gala. Tell us about that.
Oh, that's a wonderful organization that does surveys of our businesses that are invested in China. And they gather great data. They make a difference. And again, they've got a talented group. So I have brought onto my team their former president, but Craig Allen, who was an ambassador, is now running it, and he's got a wonderful team that keeps it going. But we do business with countries around the world. We'll run into problems with countries around the world, and it is so helpful to know what the companies are running into. What is the problem? They normally don't advertise it, but they're willing to tell the U.S.-China Business Council what is the difficulty, and then the Business Council can tell the government what is the difficulty, and then as a team, it can make a difference.
Let's talk for a moment about a today kind of problem. And you are chairperson of the Council on Foreign Relations and other international organizations and the U.S. Committee on China. Can you give us your thoughts on the present situation with the pandemic problem throughout the world, and how maybe you could use those platforms to influence that?
Well, it's a very serious problem, the economics. I should say I was co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm now emeritus. I've stepped down. And Bob Rubin was my co-chair, and he stepped down, and David Rubenstein has become the chair, and he's doing a wonderful job. But as we deal with these issues of our differences, we need to use some diplomacy to work through the various issues, and that takes a partnership. I think the Council on Foreign Relations does a very good job. It's a not-for-profit think tank that deals with foreign policy issues on a nonpartisan basis, and I think they're the people that they've gathered around them to do the studies, and the fellows there are outstanding. I think that Richard Haas, who is the president, has done a brilliant job, and he has been with the council for more than 15 years, and his experience is invaluable. But to have the private sector work with the government, to work with business, I think makes a difference. And to try to educate people. You and I spoke earlier about the need to invest in educating our workers. Well, studies that show what difference that would make, that it would actually have a positive effect. You can get the word out. I don't think that a lot of people read the work of the council or the CSIS or the various organizations that are doing such a good job, but at least people who are interested can get the facts, and so perhaps they can be conduits to better policy.
Well, you've really lived a good life, Carla Hills.
Don't put it in the past tense, Nan.
Well, so far.
I'll go to the office when they let me open it up, and we'll see.
Well, I'm very much like you. You know, I'm a 24/7 person. I'm not giving up yet either.
Good for you.
But you've really influenced a lot of lives. And I just want to tell you a tiny story. Not only, by the way, is my husband's name Jim McKay,
Oh, I didn't know that.
Same Jim McKay, but Jim McKay. But you have influenced my life back in the 70s, and I want to tell
Oops.
you how. My daughter Molly was born in 1970. So when you were working at HUD and were appointed as the secretary of HUD, I was executive director of the Dakota County Housing Authority.
Ah,
Encompassed all the suburbs on the south side of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Molly would have been about 5. And I looked at you and thought, boy, what I want to tell Molly, and I did, of course, is I think you should get a law degree when you go to school. Because even if you do not practice law, it seems to be a really good credential for women. I think women are taken more seriously if they have that law degree. So
I think
I
you're right.
must have said this a few thousand times over the years. And Molly did become a lawyer.
Ah, congratulations, Mom.
Lawyer today. Sometimes I don't think that people realize how much they influence other people's lives. And you really did. You influenced so many of us, particularly those women in housing who many of them have management jobs. I was very unusual to be executive director in the late 70s because mostly were men. So when you became the secretary of HUD, the highest position in HUD, we all kind of went, wow, if she can do it, then maybe we can do it. So you were that role model, kind of a mentor in a way, because we were watching what you did.
You're very generous.
No, I'm very serious. And I think that you really made a very big impact on all of the women in housing, because when you look today at what the positions are for women in housing, there are at least, if not more, women in management positions in housing authorities, at least, than, of course, there ever were, or that we ever imagined that there would be back then.
Right.
So I really thank you, Carla Hills, for all the wonderful things that you've accomplished and for the lives that you have touched.
Well, Nan McKay, you are a wonderful interviewer and extremely generous, and I thank you for that. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
And you too.
Thank you.